Sought to understand why some nations prospered while others stayed in poverty. This was the first real exploration into what became economics. This is how economics as a field started. Now, throughout nearly the whole of human history, we lived in a state of poverty and of want. We were basically animals or cavemen until very, very recently. Finally, in the past couple hundred years, we've broken away from living in bare sustenance. In about the mid-1700s, we've experienced exponential growth. That's a hockey stick of human development you could see on the slide. However, this hasn't been constant across countries. Some countries are still poor, while in the United States, we're still very rich comparatively. So today we're going to look into why some nations prospered and why, until recently, human history was basically a Hobbesian jungle, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And why people think we came out of this Hobbesian jungle, and how we became rich. For most of human history, mankind lived in poverty. Economic historians estimate that most of humanity lived on less than $1 a day. At its peak, the ancient Romans had a GDP per capita of around $1,400 a year in today's dollars. That would be about $4 a day. So that could be considered extreme poverty in the United States, almost unheard of poverty in the United States. Until the modern day, this was the richest anyone had been in human history. And it took until London in the 1820s to really reach this height. Ancient Rome and ancient Greece invented things like the steam engine, concrete, cleaning looms, and unsupported domes. In fact, the Pantheon was the largest dome until the Superdome in 1971. But these were lost to the world for a century, and leads us to question what caused the growth in the 1700s in Western Europe? Why didn't it occur elsewhere and previous in history when people invented all these spectacular things? Greece, Rome, the Ottoman Empire, China, they were all advanced and highly scientific societies. So there's a few theories that we'll dig into next. There are a few other theories of long-run growth that I want to touch on before I get into Deirdre McCluskey's ideas. The first is Malthusian growth. This is posited by Thomas Malthus, a cleric in England in the 1700s. His basic idea was what's referred to as the Malthusian trap, that when societies experience an increase in income, that leads to a higher population. So you get this population growth. When the population growth occurs, it's going to be faster than the amount of food that these societies can make. So then it's going to lead to starvation and society becoming poor, dropping back down to where they were before. So over the long term, people's per capita wealth cannot increase. It's ironic that Thomas Malthus wrote this while the world was beginning the Great Enrichment. However, this idea of Malthusian growth explains the past very, very well. The next theory of long-run growth is the Protestant work ethic. This is an idea by Max Weber. Basically, his idea was the Protestant Reformation freed parts of northern Western Europe from domination by the Catholic Church, and in his mind, this allowed the Enlightenment to take hold, that people were less focused on the afterlife and they were focused on doing more work in this life. It's a Protestant saying that idle hands are devil's playthings. The idea was to work hard throughout your life to provide things, and that's what encouraged this long-run growth. The next is geography. That's location and natural resources that determine wealth. It makes a lot of sense. Intuitively, if you live in a place that has a lot of natural resources, that's something you can take advantage of to start selling, and you can start to build up wealth a lot earlier than other places. However, that doesn't explain a lot of growth. What's the difference between, say, Eastern Germany and West Germany right before the fall of the Berlin Wall? They had very similar natural resources, but they were in very different institutional settings. So something else is going on there. Likewise, North Korea and South Korea, very similar natural resources for those two countries, but very different levels of wealth. You also see places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which are resource rich, but people there are very poor. And finally, there's small city-states like Hong Kong and Singapore, which have been able to become very prosperous, but have next to no natural resources. The last one is the idea of institutions. This comes from people like Douglas North and Darren Smoglu. The basic idea is that individuals are acting intentionally with whatever they do, but they view the world through the lens inherited from their culture and the built-up experience of their lives. So, because of this, institutions are very important for long-run growth. If you live in an institutional setting like we do in the United States that encourages people to start businesses, encourages people to sell things, encourages people to be entrepreneurs and develop new ideas and bring them to market. If that's encouraged, if that's praised, if that's looked upon well, and if the government provides enough protection, so there's private property rights, there's courts if you've been wronged, legal contracts can be assumed to be enforced. If the individual that you're contracting with doesn't enforce it, the state will enforce it. These sort of things are necessary for societies to become rich. And if they're not in place, you'll see people doing things that don't build wealth or that destroy wealth. And once a civilization that doesn't have these incentives in place, if they create these institutions that create proper incentives, then you'll see wealth take off. Of those theories of growth, I think the institutional theory of growth is the most persuasive of those, but they all can make a good argument for the causes of long-run growth, and at least in certain situations. The final one is Deirdre McCluskey's. We'll talk about this the most. Her idea is that it's ideas that changed the world, that brought us enrichment, and it's what she calls the bourgeois virtues. So she says that none of those previous ideas are radical enough to increase incomes by 3,000% in 200 years. That's a hockey stick of human development from the first slide. Good institutions, Karl Marx credited the capital formation, so literally just businesses buying machines to help make products cheaper. The geography that people live in. These things don't explain why we've experienced so much growth over this time. So she credits ideas, or more specifically, a culture where ideas are permitted to be tried, where anyone can have a go at being an entrepreneur. Avoid the term capitalism when she talks about the free market. She likes to use two phrases. The first is trade-tested betterment, and the second one, more succinctly, innovism. So it's focused on entrepreneurs instead of the capital investments they're making. These new ideas, these new products that are being brought to market that are able to solve problems that we didn't know we had before, or problems that we hadn't been able to solve for years and years and years. So to go back through this, we'll have to look at a little bit of history of Western Europe and about how these bourgeois values became valued. So in her thesis, the Great Enrichment began in the Low Countries, so Holland and Belgium, and it hopped across the Channel to England, and that's where it really took hold. Basically, the aristocracy was destroyed in Holland and Belgium in the 1600s. So then the bourgeois, these are the middle class, so there are artisans, there are traders, merchants, shopkeepers, bar owners. They became almost like the elites of society because there were no aristocrats. Now, aristocrats did not look favorably upon innovation going through this period from the Middle Ages all the way up until the modern age. You can imagine a British lord with all these estates fearing innovation that would upend his privilege and his place among society, especially for this new commoner just because they were able to invent some new machinery. But in England in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the culture began to change and they began to accept trade and commerce as honorable. And McCluskey spends hundreds of pages going through plays and books written in the 16, 17, and 1800s, showing through the characters how in the 16, 1700s or early 1700s, they looked down upon trade and upon merchants and the bourgeois class in general. But by the end of the 1700s and the 1800s, they were looking very positively on trade and commerce, entrepreneurship, and the bourgeois class in general. Institutions and culture are both incredibly important for long-run growth. Institutions are what allow individuals to reap the rewards of commerce and to enforce contracts. These things allow them to physically get wealth and to maintain wealth, and allow the businesses to actually, contract with one another, work with one another, to be sure that they're going to get paid. This enhances and encourages growth. This allows the market to function. At the same time, cultural attitudes encourage entrepreneurship, which is the true driver of growth. It's that individual looking out there, seeing that there's a need not being met, and figuring out a way to meet it. Getting that new product or that new service, or just that new production technique that's better and cheaper or faster. That's what makes us better off, and that's what causes this long-run growth. Also, in England and in the Low Countries at this time, dignity for commoners was a new experience. It was new. It was unheard of pretty much anywhere in the world before this. Suddenly, in these places, in Britain and across the Channel, the Low Countries, there was honor for thrift and exchange, things that were looked down upon. For instance, in the Roman Empire, commerce was looked down upon. So someone who became rich through commerce was considered lower than, the aristocrats who had large family estates for years before that, for generations before that. Humans are willing to sacrifice in order to punish other peoples when they defect from the norms of society. They're willing to make themselves worse off to make sure that others maintain the norms. So these norms are extremely important. If norms, these cultural attitudes, are against commerce and thrift, you're going to see very little commerce and thrift because people are going to be punished for engaging in that. On the other hand, if you encourage this, you're going to get more and more entrepreneurship, these new businesses being formed, these new ideas being put into practice. These norms are incentives for individuals to act. Now, this change in attitude led Britain to become a nation of shopkeepers, what they were called at the time. That everyone out there was willing to exchange. They were opening all these new businesses, which was, it makes sense to us now because there's so many businesses around us, but this was unheard of at the time. And it's hard to stress that without literally going back there and living in that society. It's hard to imagine how revolutionary this was. So instead of prioritizing and respecting the hierarchies of the past, so look at whether it's the church or the aristocrats or the king and queen themselves, they were prioritizing and they were respecting individuals that were helping bring them new products, new things that they needed, which is revolutionary. Now, after the Second English Civil War, Lovell Richard Rumbold declared from the scaffold, "I'm sure there was no man marked of God above another, for none comes in this world with a saddle on his back, neither any booted and spurred to ride him." When he was executed, the crowd laughed at his statement, but within 200 years, it became a cliche. Now, to Deirdre McCloskey, this is the revolution that sparked the Great Enrichment, which he calls the bourgeois revaluation, the change in focus from the aristocracy, from the old way of looking at the world, to the new way world that honored and respected innovation and industry. So, to summarize McCloskey's ideas, historically, cultures were hostile to industry. Societies across the world looked down upon and they discouraged innovation, trade, exchange, these things. And because of that, humans lived in poverty, and their life rarely improved, and when it did, not for very long. Then, by historical accident, the Low Countries, they lost their aristocracy, and they began to thrive by accepting industry and investment and entrepreneurship, allowing new ideas to be tried, and the best ones to rise to the top. Then it hopped across the English Channel, and that attitude really took hold in England. The Industrial Revolution dates to before the Great Enrichment. It was only after the Industrial Revolution occurred, and cultural norms changed to encourage entrepreneurship, encourage people to use these new inventions to create new products to make people's lives better, that the British really began to prosper, and that growth that we saw in that first slide, that hockey stick of human development, when it really shot up exponentially. So her idea of what causes growth is less economic and more cultural, but we can still talk about culture in economic terms and use it to help understand what's going on. So to put it all together, McCloskey doesn't doubt the impact of other things on wealth. especially institutions, are extremely important. Here we're looking for the cons. What is the one thing that made these places rich and it didn't make other places? So obviously things like institutions, very important. Capital, obviously very important. Having the machines to be able to produce a lot of goods, to produce them effectively, these are extremely important for wealth. But it's not the cause. You can have a place with bad institutions, with bad culture, and a lot of capital, and you won't get the sort of material prosperity that we have in the United States today. So, if you think of the combustion triangle, the idea of the three things you need to make fire, we can have the enrichment triangle. So the first is capital. This is the fuel, the things we need to create products. Next is the institutions. Institutions are like the oxygen in the combustion triangle. It's the environment within which growth occurs. So without proper institutions, like without oxygen, we will not have growth. Even with good capital, poor institutions are going to choke off growth. And the third is culture. This is the spark in the combustion triangle. Even with the other two present, so you have capital and you've got good institutions. Places historically like China, the Mayans, the Ottoman Empire, they all had the first two. But they didn't have the cultural attitudes that supported and honored innovation, that encouraged entrepreneurship, business formation, and business growth. When you don't have those cultural ideas, you won't see the sort of growth that we've experienced in the West in the past 200 years, and now we're seeing it all across the world. I personally think McCluskey underweights the importance of institutions in her talks, in her analysis, in an effort to sell her theory, rather than just being a component of the institutional theory. But largely, I agree with her theory. I think it's a very interesting, as a different way of looking at long run growth that most people don't do. And because we very rarely, if ever, talk about in these terms, I thought it was something interesting and worthwhile to bring up in this class.